Rabbi Sai, let me start with this. Chassidus explains all parochial phenomena, let's put it that way. Chassidus doesn't just talk about holy things. Chassidus shows you how regular, everyday things all have meaning. For example, listen to this. There's laying, there's sitting, there's standing, there's walking, there's running, there's two types of jumping in Chassidus. And each one is a different concept that is on certain occasions applied to different levels in Seder Shtashos. Laying, sitting, standing, walking, running, jumping, and there's two kinds of jumping. Jumping with one leg in front of the other and jumping with both legs. And the question, of course, which is more extreme. And of course, the rule is laying is lower than sitting, and sitting is lower than standing, and standing is lower than walking, and walking is lower than running, and running is lower than jumping, and jumping one level is lower than jumping the other level. And that makes sense. And again, my Maimonim explain each of these things, believe it or not. But there's always the other way to look at it, right? The other thing Chassidus does is makes a beautiful picture, then turns it upside down. They call it Chaysim HaMesapach, right? The whole of Ishtalshalos, when you look at it in the source, it's backwards. Right. So Chochmah is the highest sfira, in the Sheidish it's the lowest inyan. Malchus the lowest sfira, in the Sheidish it's the highest inyan. So in Nun Beis, 1991 to 92, when we came to Parshas Vayetze, which describes, of course, Yaakov Avinu sleeping at Har HaMoriah, Vayishka b'mokem hahu. So the Rebbe spoke about Yaakov Avinu laying down. He lay down and he put he put stones around his head. Of course, the famous sikh of the Rebbe, if you're afraid of wild animals, why are you putting them around your head? Put them around your whole body. And of course, the answer is the animals Yaakov Avinu was afraid of were not the biological type. They were the metaphysical type. He was worried about his head. So the Poshet Pshat is Vayishka b'mokem hu. Yaakov Avinu lays down, shows on the lowest madrega. Why? So of course there's a Hayoim Yoim that says, what's the difference between a person and an animal? That a person walks upright, bipedally, upright. Animals walk quadrupedally, right? They walk horizontally. The difference is animals see the ground, and a human being sees the sky. And the fact that a person is able to see the sky means that he sees he sees he who presides in the sky. That means the Eibishter. So walking upright has huge advantage. What's the Kabbalah of walking upright? This is a Hemshech Samachei Rosh Hashanah. Walking upright means that my Chabad is higher than my Chagas, and my Chagas is higher than my Nihi. My brain is higher than my torso is higher than my pelvis. Which means, Kabbalistically, that's the Madrega of Elam HaBriya, by the way. Being halfway bent over as Elam HaYetzirah, being completely curled up as Elam HaAsiyah. My mind is able to relate to ideas that it can't feel, and it's able to go past itself, to bring those ideas to itself. And when a person is standing upright, that's what connote that the brain goes out, gets information, brings it to the person, and then processes it down into the heart and into the actions that the person should live based on a higher property, higher value. An animal is this way. The head and the torso and the pelvis, those are very nice words. But the top, the middle, and the bottom of the animal are all the same madrega. And as such, the lower levels control the higher levels. Like it says in Tanya Perek Vav, V'seichel HaMelidan. The Nefesh Abahamis is very smart, he's brilliant. But the Nefesh Abahamis doesn't use his smarts to look for truth. The Nefesh Abahamis uses his smarts to satisfy its animalism. When the brain is higher than the heart, the brain pursues ideas independent of the heart. When the brain is in the same level of the heart tells the brain, use your brain to make excuses for this taiva and for that taiva, for that midah, for that midah, and so forth. You follow? That's the significance of walking upright. Accordingly, the lowest position a person could be in is when they're laying flat. Laying flat means your head is not higher than your torso, and your torso is not higher than your pelvis. Your chabad is not higher than your chagas, and your chagas is not higher than your nihi. And the presumption is your whole level is the level of nihi. Which of course is how it's explained in Chassidus and Kabbalah when a person sleeps. It says even in Sifrei Musar, the brain doesn't really work, they dream, it's all confused. The heart, the higher emotions doesn't really work. What works very well when you sleep? The Keach HaIkul, the Nefesh Hazad, Nefesh HaIkul. The level of the person that's physically doing processes to digest food and break it down into minerals and to create new blood cells and to freshen up the blood. When you sleep, your body heals, your body rejuvenates. But it's all nihi stuff. It's all on the basic biological level. It's not about the sophistication of being a human being who has higher emotions, and the sophistication of a human being who has abstract intelligence to look for emes. When you're sleeping, all of that is shut down. Your chabad is shut down. Your chagas is shut down. All that's left is your nihi. That's one angle. Says Rebbe, but there's another angle. And the other angle is not that your brain is shut down because it's controlled by the heart. Not that your heart is shut down, that it's controlled by the kidneys and the liver and the other metabolic tools, but that the entire human being is neutralized. We are complex. We're made up of parts. We're called, the fancy word for that is we're sophisticated. When you lay down flat, you're not sophisticated, you're simple. But there's two sides to simple. One side to simple is that it's lower than sophisticated, and the other side to simple is that it's higher than sophisticated. How is simple lower than sophisticated? It's obvious. I'm not using my mind, I'm not using my heart, I'm not using my discretion, I'm not using my judgment. I'm not figuring out whether something is true or false, something is right or wrong. I'm not feeling whether something feels right or wrong, I'm just being. The flip side to that is, if you neutralize all the differences in a person, you come to a place where the person is one, and that's the Yechidah. There's two places where everybody becomes one. In the Lashna Rashi, Mechilta Rashi, in Pashas Yisrei, Ki Ish Echad B'Leiv Echad. How do all people become the same? Either in the lowest level or in the highest level. On the lowest level, we're all the same, because in the lowest level, there's no difference between one and the other. One guy is smarter, one guy is not so smart. It makes no difference. We're, as the Rashbat say, boiling sacks of meat and bone. And on the highest level, where the sophisticated components of humanhood are less significant, because we're connecting to Hashem in an infinite way, called Yechidah. Whether it's Amunah, or it's Mesiras Nefesh, or it's Tshuva. So the Rebbe says in this Sicha, that Vayishka v'Hamokam Ahu, when Yankov Avinu lays down at Har HaMoriah, the significance of this act is that Yankov is ascending, he's not descending. He's ascending to a level where the difference between his brain and his heart and his pelvis, his chabad and chas and he are immaterial, don't make a difference. Because you're coming to a place where his connection to Hashem is completely beyond reason. That's what the Rebbe says in that Sikh. In this Maimer, it's called Nefillas Apayim. When you're davening, you're climbing a ladder. And climbing a ladder is evolved hard, and it's sophisticated. Right? The chiddush is that you don't start off your day by saying, prove it. Right? That's the whole art. You don't start off your day by saying, prove it. You start off the day by saying, I accept. This is true, which is already a valgavaldik azach. Your morning begins not with what's the proof, but with meidani, I submit, I acquiesce, I accept, which is a big deal, but it's simple. And then you go from there to using your heart, you go from there to using your mind, and you go from there to using all kinds of fancy schmancy levels of your mind, and then you're standing in front of the Eibishter. When you're standing in front of the Eibishter, you achieve Bittul B'Metzias. But that's a graduation of the climbing the earlier steps of the ladder, says the Rebbe, so it's not Bittul Atzmi. That Bittul is not coming from inside, the Bittul is coming from the Eibishter. You finish Menesre and you fall to the ground. Of course, we just do this on some occasions. But Nefillas Apayim, which we do by sitting down and making sure that there's a sleeve in front of our hand, so that our one part of the body is not touching the other part of the body, in which case it's not considered a blockage, but you use dafka the sleeve, and you do it like this, whatever it is, that in Psalm 25, Kapitel Chafei and Tilim, when you're saying that, you are figuratively falling flat on the ground. This falling flat on the ground, it comes after climbing the ladder, but it's not the fifth step. It's not. It's abandoning the ladder. That's what it is. You daven. Davening is climbing a ladder. And by the way, you're going to continue, like I told you, Revolt Tzir is going to be going back down to Bria. Shir Shal Yem is going back down to Yetzirah. Kavi is going back down to Asiyah. But Nefillas Apayim, it's a part of the davening, but it's almost as if you're suspending the ladder. When you put your head down, which is figuratively laying flat on the ground. Yesterday I gave you two forms for this. I gave you the example of Hishtadchus, and I told you the story with the Frierdiker Rebbe, which I read recently. And with the Frierdiker Rebbe by the Tzir of Shlomo Karliner, if I remember correctly, he got a key to get in. It was a tiny little space, he had to creep in, and he lay down on the cave. That's called Hishtadchus, laying down. And the other example I gave you was bowing. That when we bow on Yom Kippur, we get on our knees. But in the Beis HaMikdash, when they bow, they spread eagle. They spread the flat on the ground. Why? Because this is the level, not of lowest common denominator, it's level of highest common. It's a place of neshama which is connected to Hashem on a level which is completely beyond reason. We're going now to put him, right? In 1 week from today is put him. It's adalo yoda, it's goydel, it's beyond reason. It's the connection to Hashem which is completely beyond any limitation. It's infinite. And the Rebbe says Nefillas Apayim is bitul עצמי, which means not only is laying down flat on the ground a bitul b'metzias. Now understand what bitul b'metzias means. Bitul b'metzias means it's a bitul that I'm not creating. Correct? Bitul b'metzias means, as I explained to you at length, a bitul which the Eibishter creates. But Shmoneh Esrei is also a bitul b'metzias. But the bitul b'metzias of Shmoneh Esrei is not a bitul עצמי. Because the bitul b'metzias of Shmoneh Esrei is the fourth rung in a ladder. I went from bitul hayesh to bitul b'metzias because it's the fourth rung in the ladder. And the rungs before are yesh. When my bitul hayesh turns into bitul b'metzias, it's taka bitul b'metzias. As I explained it to you, you're becoming an expression of Hashem. But it's not happening from you, it's happening from the Eibishter. It's not a bitul עצמי. Nefillas Apayim is also a bitul b'metzias. I'm falling on the ground, but Nefillas Apayim is a bitul b'metzias, which is a bitul עצמי. And there's a very simple explanation for it. There's a very, very simple explanation for it. Chassidus talks an awful lot about slaves. And Chassidus makes it sound like the greatest thing in the world is to be a slave. Now we know that we don't like slaves, right? We don't like slavery. But Chassidus talks an awful lot about slaves. But not a slave who has a physical master, a slave of the Eibishter. So there's my mother, the Mikneh Rav in Samach Vav, very famous, right? Talked about different kinds of relationships. You have a relationship of a teacher and a student. You have a relationship of a king and his ministers. You have a relationship of a minister and his subordinates. You have a relationship of a father and children, all kinds of relationships. And you have a relationship of a master and a slave. And the Samach Vav argues that every relationship is conditional. Every connection, if I'm your son and you're my father, our relationship is based on what we have in common. How close I am to you. Which means you like me because of the fact that I share properties with you. They have similar characteristics. If you're my student and I'm your teacher, it's because you understand what I'm teaching. All these relationships are conditional. What's a slave? A slave is a person who becomes the property of his master to such an extent that whatever the slave does is as if the master did it. Whatever the slave does is as if the master did it. If a master who has many slaves built a beautiful palace, and in front of the palace appears a beautiful landscaping, he didn't do anything. He got a bunch of slaves to lay out the trees and the grass and the flowers. And when his guests come, just look what I did. Look how beautiful I made it. He didn't do anything.
Well, you see that about any designer.
Correct. It's different, but point well taken, right? Because his slave doesn't exist. His slave is his arm or his leg, which is bad, which is mean. Except if your slave is God, right? If you want a relationship with the Eibishter, how do you do that? You want to learn from Hashem. Okay, study His Torah. If you learn from Hashem and study Torah, how much of Hashem's wisdom do you know? You know, nothing minus the smallest measure. Hashem's wisdom is infinite. Our brains are finite. How connected are we to Him if we're trying to understand Him? Right? If you want to feel Him, it's also very limited. If you want a relationship with the Eibishter, that should be a complete relationship, where 100% of you is connected to 100% of Him. There's only one way. Take me over. Invade me. Take me over. Make me an extension of yourself that doesn't exist in children and parents, doesn't exist in students and teachers, doesn't exist in kings and officers. That only exists in what's called the Chassidus, Ein Melech Le'am, simple people, slaves, common folk. Because the relationship between a slave and a master is that his master's will becomes the slave's will. Total is batless. When your master is God and you're his slave, you now have an infinite relationship with him. Your relationship is not conditional. Your relationship is not based on how much you understand or how much you feel or how much you accept or how much you agree with or how much it sits right with you. When you accept that you are a slave of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the relationship between you and the Eibishter is defined by him, not by you. So it's an infinite relationship. And of course we have a name for this. We don't call it Avdus every day, just on Mondays and Thursdays. We call it Kabbalah Seil. Kabbalah Seil Machsham. If I accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, which means I put on myself a harness, which says he's going to sit on my back, and I'm going to carry him wherever he wishes to go. When I become the slave of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, his will becomes my will. If his will becomes my will, I am him. And that's the pshat, Eved Melech Melech. When you're a servant of a king, you're a king. When you're a slave of a king, you're a king. So Chassidus makes a very, very counterintuitive argument. You're never closer to God than when you're simple. You're never closer to God when you acquiesce, when you bittul yourself. If you come to Hashem with your brain, it's not defined by his brain, it's defined by yours, which is limited. If you come to Hashem with your heart, it's not defined by his heart, it's defined by your heart, which is limited. When you come to Hashem with your senses, it's not defined by his senses, it's defined by your senses, which are limited. But when you come to Hashem and throw yourself at him and say, I belong to you, I'm an extension of you, now the relationship is by his terms. That's why in Chassidus, Kabbalah Seil is such a big deal. Avdus is such a big deal. You're never closer to God than when you don't try to get close. And that's the mashal of Yaakov Avinu laying down. Standing up means his brain is higher than his heart. Sitting is the brain is still higher than the heart, but the heart has been lowered, as they say in the Maimorim, it's not for now. Laying down either means my relationship is so nothing, all I'm doing is digesting food and healing my blood cells, creating new blood cells and actionating those blood cells and so on. Or you could say laying down means I am taking away me and putting in that space you meaning the Eibishter. If I'm taking away me and in that space I'm putting the Eibishter, that's Bittul B'Metzias. But it's also Bittul Atzmi. It came from me. Nefillas Apayim Hashem doesn't give me. Faket, when I use my heart and I use my mind and I transcend my heart and my mind to Bittul B'Metzias, that's not Bittul Atzmi. But when I lay down flat, laying down flat is not trying. Laying down flat is not climbing a ladder. Laying down flat is saying, take me over. And therefore the Rebbe argues, Nefillas Apayim, which is the figuratively laying down flat, is the Madrega Bittul Atzmi. So the way I see it, and of course I'm not qualified to have an opinion, but I'm talking anyway, right? It is that it's almost like as if Nefillas Apayim is an interruption in the middle of davening. If davening is climbing a ladder till a peak, and then coming back down that ladder till the bottom, right? Asiya, Yetzira, Bria, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya again. Nefillas Apayim is the middle of davening. But it's not part of the ladder of davening. It's part of it's an act of submission, of giving Zaf to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is not, it's not gradual, it's not step by step. It's placed after Shmoneh Esrei, because you want to go from a Bittul B'Metzias, which is not a Bittul Atzmi, to a Bittul B'Metzias, which is a Bittul Atzmi. That's where it's located, that's where it's placed in the davening. But the idea is at any time. The idea of being a slave of Hashem is total submission. Now, if you have your mind, I don't know if you have your copies of the mind. If you don't, I'm going to read it. It's all just a couple of lines. Yesterday we read it, but yesterday we read it at 7 minutes after 9 o'clock, so I was making everybody nervous including myself. So the Rebbe says like this, I'm reading inside the last couple of lines of Perek Gimel on page Shin Nun Ches. Let's start 6 lines from the end. Amnam be'emes to be sure, Hine. Gam ha-bittul b'metzias v'shmoneh esrei. Even the bittul b'metzias v'shmoneh esrei ain't a bittul atzmi. It's taka a bittul b'metzias, but it's not a bittul atzmi. It's not coming from inside of me. Because the kivan shemagir lebittul zeh. Since one reaches bittul atzmi, al yedei ha'akdomas ha'madreges shelifnei zeh, through the steps which came before, shehein be'efen shel hasaga, which are reasonable, logical, steps, gradual, how they move, and it's understood, she'ein zeh bittul atzmi. That's not a bittul atzmi. It's not a bittul that comes from me. It's a total bittul. But it's a total bittul which the Eibush did impose. It doesn't come from inside of me. Ukamation is bayel, as we explained earlier, de kivan shavedas atfiloi milmata l'mayla. Whereas, in as much as that davening is from the bottom up, hine, gam be'madrega yesed nailes, at the very, very highest levels, harei b'bchinas hayesh bilvad. It's only a bittul hayesh. Bracket. Now this is the part that I want you to see. V'lachein, and therefore, hine, gam ba'achash Shmoneh Esrei. You finish Shmoneh Esrei. Tzarech liyas Nefillas Apayim, which means literally you fall on your face. Now we don't do that, right? We don't even do kida, right? There's the kriya and kida and shtachava. We do this, but symbolically, spiritually, it's like hishtachos, it's like hishtachava, laying down flat on the ground, and this is bittul atzmi. Now wait, if I'm throwing myself to the ground after I climbed the ladder, asiya yitzira bria tzilas, how is this bittul atzmi? So he says 2 things. Number 1, Shemakiv es haresh v'haregel b'shaveh. What I'm doing by throwing myself to the ground is I'm neutralizing the whole ladder. Right? What's Meida Ani? My nihi, my pelvis. What's Psukat Zimra? My torso, my chagas. What's Birchas Kishme and Krishme? My bina, my chabad. What's Shmenesre? My chokhmah, let's say. So I'm climbing a ladder step by step. When I lay that flat on the ground, what I'm doing is take that whole ladder and throw it away. We're not climbing ladders. We're submitting. Now, what's weird about it is that after Nefillas Apayim, you stand back up and you continue climbing back down the ladder. So Nefillas Apayim is sort of an interruption in the sequence, in the steps of Avedas HaTfilah. But that's what you're doing. When you fall flat on your face, flat on the ground, you're submitting to the Eibishter in what kind of a way? Where you're saying, take me over. Take me over. I don't want to have my own will, not my own mind, not my own heart, not my own senses, not my own will. Your will should become mine, and that's considered, it's considered a bitul עצמי. And the Rebbe says a few words. K'moi ha-bitul d'meida ani. You see? You see it? K'moi ha-bitul d'meida ani. The bitul d'meida ani. Meida ani is the very first step. And it's considered the lowest step. Right? Meida ani is the first step. It's considered the lowest step. So the Rebbe says, you know what else Meida ani is? Meida ani is higher than Atzilus. Because Meida ani is the equivalent of laying flat. You say Meida ani laying in bed. There's two ways to look at laying flat. One way of looking flat, laying flat, is looked at as, I don't have a mind, I don't have a heart, I don't have senses, I'm just a simple person. And the other way of laying flat is, I don't have a mind, I don't have a heart, I don't have senses. I'm sacrificing all of my sophistication to belong to Hashem, to be an Eved. This is what the Rebbe says in the Sichas. Meida ani is the lowest level, and Meida ani is the highest level. Meida ani is nefesh, and Meida ani is yechida. So the Rebbe says, just like we explained Meida ani in the beginning of Davening, that it's the lowest level, but it has a certain property that makes it higher than the highest level. That's how the Rebbe explains Nefillas Apayim, putting flat on your back. You know, I have a story that's tickling my inside of my brain. And when things tickle inside my brain and I can't scratch them, I usually itch them by giving them out. It's not such a big story, but it's a story that I heard, that I never ever told, so I love to tell stories. I have a very dear friend, his name is Yankee Tauber. Yankee Tauber is the best English writer of Lubavitch. There was a period where we were quite close. We worked together in the yeshiva in Albany. Yankee Tauber's grandfather was Tzvi Yuir, Mr. Steinmetz. Tzvi Meir Steinmetz. Rabbi Fenton named his son Tzvi Hirsch Meir. Says after two people, but Tzvi Meir is his aide. His wife is a Yafi. His wife is a Silva. His wife is a Yafi. Yafi is also an Edom by Steinmetz. So he came to the yeshiva in Albany, to Troy. He came to Fabreng. They brought the who's who of the Lubavitch came to Fabreng in Albany. And he Fabrenged for us. And he sat with us a whole night, told us wonderful stories. I heard stories from him that I never heard before or after. And most of them I've had opportunity to repeat, but this one I never repeated. His first connection to Lubavitch was as the principal of Beis Rivka. He lasted 6 months. The average life expectancy of principal of Beis Rivka in those years was 6 months. Because not only you didn't get paid, but the teachers didn't get paid, and the teachers complained to you. So as a rule, if you were hired to be the principal of Beis Rivka, you were probably not a Lubavitcher, because you didn't know what was flying inside Lubavitch. And at the end of those 6 months, you were so angry at the Hanhol Beis Rivka that you were angry at the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that his name, yeah. He said that he met that Rebbe, and when he left Beis Rivka, he went into the Rebbe and said, I'm leaving Beis Rivka, I'm not leaving Lubavitch. And he remembers how happy the Rebbe was that he didn't take it personally. You know, that he didn't say, okay, because the Menhala Beis Rivka take of Kapara, so the Lubavitch Rebbe did request. He had a very special relationship with him. He was a very intelligent man. I don't think Tzvi Meir Steinmetz slept in a bed. He didn't have a day and a night. 24 hours. He was a businessman, a very successful real estate person. But he was a businessman, very interesting person, very interesting man. Very special. For most of his life, he was clean shaven. At the end of his life, he grew a big beard. He became a big rabbi. But here's a story that he told us once. I forgot even the context, but it was at that Fabrengen that he was behind the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was very makar of him. And he walked up to the Rebbe, and he said to the Rebbe, again, I don't remember the context, he said to the Rebbe, Ich bin ofar tachas kapois raglei hatzadikim. Which means, I am the dust under the palms of the feet of the tzaddik. He wanted to tell the Rebbe how dedicated he is. Or it's a Maimon Chazal. He told the Rebbe, I am the dust under the palms of the feet of tzaddikim. And this was his way of saying, I'm an intellectual, I'm a poet, I'm a sophisticated person, I've got my own life. Not in my relationship to the Rebbe. In my relationship to the Rebbe, I'm dust under the palms of the feet of tzaddikim. Ofer tachas kapes raglei tzaddikim. That's how the Rebbe phrased it. Ofer tachas kapes raglei tzaddikim. That's how he phrased it. It's a story, it's a simple story, but when I was preparing this morning's class, the story came to me and I said, okay, I have a story, let me tell it. Now, Rabbi said, I got 4 minutes. Let's do the questions, okay? It should go easy. 3:28. Where in Davening do we have Bitul Atzmi? The answer is Nefillas Apayim. Question 3:29. How is this possible if, as explained by Shemon Esrei, if you start out as Bitul Ayesh, you cannot get the Bitul Atzmi? So how is Nefillas Apayim Bitul Atzmi? The answer is because it's not a step. Bitul Atzmi is like throwing away the ladder. You're not building on the past, you're throwing away the past. You're not saying you go from, pelvis to torso to brain to chokhmah. You're throwing the ladder away. You're neutralizing all of the steps that came before by laying down flat on the ground. And because you're neutralizing all the steps that came before, you're not, even though you are building on the past, you're not building on the past. And that's why it could be a Bitul Atzmi. 3:30. What is ishtatchos? Ishtatchos means going to the oil, going to the cave of a tzaddik. 3:31. Why is it called by that name? Because mystically, the idea of ishtatchos is that you're laying down your body on top of the body of the tzaddik, your head against his head, your torso against his torso, your pelvis against his pelvis. In other words, your nihi against his nihi, your chagas against his chagas, your chabad against his chabad. But you're laying flat. And the reason you're laying flat is because those connections are not individual. You're not communicating intellectually, not communicating emotionally. You're connecting on the level of Atzilus. Neshama and Neshama Netzelis. For those who don't know, Atzilus is the madreg of Chaya. It's the makif. It's the neutralized level of the Neshama, which meets the neutralized level. When you go to the Oyhel, whatever you experience, what's happening is, I told you this many times, you have an atom. Yeah, an atom has an atomic number, which means it has a center with neutrons and protons, right? And then you have, at a distance from the nucleus, electrons rotating very quickly, right? Oscillating very fast, correct? Those electrons are kept in place by the force of gravity of the center, right? But they're also pushed away by the opposing force of the electron. So when it's perfect, it's like a planet, like the moon rotating around the Earth, right? It's being held close, but not, it doesn't crash into the, right? The negative charge doesn't let it become one with the positive charge, but the positive, so it rotates around. Now what happens, you bring two atoms together, the electrons begin to rotate around both of them. This is called a bond. And now you have a compound. Two atoms together become an entity, compound, right? The three atoms. So the electrons create glue. And depending on the atomic number and other factors, it's either a gas or a liquid or a solid. In other words, if the bonds of the different atoms are stronger and firmer, it becomes more solid. If the bonds are more weak, then it becomes a liquid. If the bonds are even weaker, then it becomes a gas, right? You guys went to school, so you're all educated, so you know these things. I went to Al-Tayyah, that's why I know these things. And of course, I could be wrong, but that's the way I understand it, okay? That's what happens. This is what happens when two people are in a room. This is what happens. You put a husband and wife under a chuppah. The chuppah means joining together, not my body and your body, my halo and your halo, my makif and your makif. The bodies remain separate. But every human being has around him a halo, an energy field, a makif, a chaya. You put two people near each other, the two chuppahs begin to circle each other, and the two chuppahs become one. That's the mystical concept of a marriage. That's the idea of a chuppah. A canopy which brings together the chassan's chuppah and the kal's chuppah makes them into one chuppah. That's how it's understood mystically. This is what happens when you're a person. So when you're a person who's, who you can talk to. So there's different levels, right? I can do something for you, you can do something for me, that's nefesh. I can feel you, you can feel me, that's ruach. I can understand you, you can understand me, that's neshama. I can sense you subconsciously, and you could sense me subconsciously, that's chaya. When you go to a cave of a tzaddik, you can't do something physical with the tzaddik. You can't feel him. You can't understand him. The souls connect on what's called neshama and neshama ne'etzelas, the madrega of Atzilus, which is chaya, which is makif. That's why it's called ishtatchus. Laying down flat means this connection is not based on what separates the brain from the heart, and what separates the heart from the pelvis, what separates the Nehi from the Chabad from the Chagas. It's a madrega of connection where all those are the same. And if you ever studied the Maimer, the middle Rebbe Nishtachos, he explains two levels. The lower level is the neshama of the person who comes to the Beis HaChaim, becomes one with the neshama of the tzaddik, and he experiences the light of the neshama of the tzaddik, and when he goes away, he leaves it behind. The highest madrega is called Hasaga. Your neshama joins with the neshama of the tzaddik and the madrega of Chaya, but the connection is so deep that you actually take away something which you can process in your neshama. In other words, you can, I don't know if the right language is you hear words, but you walk away and words form. There's a pnimius that comes from the meeting. So even though initially the meeting is hishtatchus, is chaya with chaya, makif with makif, but when the makif and the makif are very, very strong, when the person's goof is very, very edel and the chushim and the koichas are very, very developed, there's something called asaga. Biggest tzaddikim come away from the kavod of a tzaddik and say divrei Torah. The biggest thing with the kavod of a tzaddik, I tell you, the tzaddik told me to tell you. Now, I don't know how this works. Is it a conversation like I'm talking to you? I doubt it. It's more like the light of this tzaddik and the light of this tzaddik touch, and they become one light, and the light of the tzaddik takes away from the light of other tzaddik a light which answers questions, which translates into knowing crystal clear the answers to questions. Like nevuah. A nevuah is a vision. Nevuah, a navi sees God. And he comes away and says, God said. God didn't talk to him, I'm talking to you. There was a vision, and from the vision there came what's called the chakika. Something was left over, which is a communicable message. But the meeting is a meeting of makif, neshama, neshama, ne'etzeles. The level of the meeting of the neshama is atzilus with atzilus. It's not nefesh with nefesh, ruach with ruach, neshama with neshama. It's only chaya with chaya, and yechida with yechida. So laying down flat is consistent with the nature of the meeting. Because the level where the two souls are meeting is not where you are a distinctive person. Mind, heart, pelvis, right? Chabad, chagas, nehi. But it's in a madrege which neutralizes all of that. That's the concept of ishtadchus. And that's the same idea as Nefillas Apayim. Next question. How is this the same as ishtachava? Ishtachava means laying down flat. And laying down flat means you're giving away to the Eibush. You're surrendering all of your sophistication to have a relationship with him of simplicity, of avdus. And this is transcendent. This is more than sophisticated. Ready? What is Nefillas Apayim? How is it understood Kabbalistically? Nefillas Apayim is you finish Manasseh, you do a bunch of stuff, right? What's the first thing you do after Shmoneh Esrei? Very first thing. Vidui. Confession. Shamnu, Bagadnu, you know what means? You sinned, you stole, you lied, you cheated. Me, I'm perfect. I don't want to make myself, I don't want to ruin myself and say, ich hab gesündigt. Right? After you say Vidui, then you into Nefillas Apayim. You say, give me this arachmim. You evoke Hashem's mercies for forgiveness and so on. And when you fall down, falling down is not a part of Vidui, it's called Tchina. What Tchina means? Pleading, begging, besieging. Tachanun, what does the word tachanun mean? To ask for Hashem's chanina. Vidui and tachanun go together, but they're very different things. Vidui is a mitzvah seder deraisa, confession, and we do it every day, twice or three times. Right? But along with the vidui comes tachanun. It's two separate things that are joined. Tachanun is pleading with Hashem. Tachanun, you lay down flat because you want to beg Hashem not from the position of your strength, your mind, your heart, and your senses. You want to beg Hashem a place of neutralization of all of that. Look at question 334. Explain makif esareish v'regel b'shava. Shemakif esareish v'regel b'shava means you do an avoida that neutralizes the difference between the brain and the body. It's like throwing away the ladder. That's how you have to understand it. Davening is a ladder with gradualism, step-by-stepism. Nefillas Apayim is throwing the ladder away. I'm discarding the whole idea that my brain is better than my heart, that my heart is better than my nihi, and I'm replacing it with a place of great simplicity. This simplicity is either lower than anything or higher than anything. And that's the concept of Nefillas Apayim, that by throwing away the ladder, I'm related to the Eibush like a slave. What's the advantage of being a slave? The advantage of being a slave is he gives himself completely away to his master, which sounds very bad. But as a consequence of that, whatever he does is as if the master did it. So he's 100% connected to 100% of what his master is, in submission. And the basis for that is to throw away the ladder. Makiv, esareish, varegel, b'shavat. 335, how is this connected to Meidani? Because Meidani is exactly that. Meidani is set in bed. When you're laying flat, chachafil, the meaning is to sit up. And the concept of Meidani means I'm accepting something which I don't feel and I don't understand and I don't sense, and I accept it. So it says in the Maimorim, it says in the Sikha, that Meidani can be seen as lower than anything, but it also says that Meidani can be seen as higher than anything, and they're both true. Meidani is lower than anything because it's about total hisbatlos. Meidani is higher than anything because when I'm saying Meidani, I'm giving myself away. And in giving myself away, I become an extension of my master. Clear? So I don't know if you want to say Shechayanu, but in Mitzvah Hashem, next class is Perek Daled. And Perek Daled is no longer Tefillah. It's back to the juxtaposition of Torah and Tefillah, which we learned about in Cheshvan. If you could remember that far back.